This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Neatsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. It's actually been a little bit since I did one of these. I did one, I think, for the Spider-Man set, and then some personal stuff in my life, plus the general dissatisfaction that everyone had with Spider-Man made it so it didn't make a whole lot of sense for me to make a bunch more content about that set. But the good news is that we have another set coming out, and it is another Universes Beyond set, but it does not look like an abject disaster the way Spider-Man did basically from the beginning. You know, I did a whole video and wrote a whole article on Card Kingdom about small sets and how they can go bad and limited, and this format had all of those problems and more. It just wasn't a good set for limited, probably the worst one we've seen, at least in the Arena era. So yeah, it just wasn't good. But the good news is this Avatar set looks more like Final Fantasy. It is not a small set like Spider-Man was. It's not a pick 2 draft format like Spider-Man was. The cards seem to be well designed, unlike lots of them in Spider-Man. There's not a lot of weird repetitive stuff going on. And it also, you know, the Avatar franchise, which I'm only vaguely familiar with, is at least a fantasy setting, so it doesn't seem weird either. So overall, I'm pretty excited about this set. It's going to be cool to get a new set after Spider-Man being such a dud. And I do think this one looks pretty good. And in this video, I'm going to do like my general overview of what we know about the format so far. We don't know everything right now because it's only the first week of previews. There's only like a week and some change worth of previews though, and that means next Friday will be when my set review starts. And before we get into the content in this video, let me remind you that if you're a patron or a channel member, you get some set review related perks. You get access to my ongoing notes that I update during preview season, kind of like a rough draft of my set review. And you also get access to a spreadsheet that has all of my grades once the set review is complete. You can find out how to be a patron or a channel member in the description, so check those out. But yeah, in this video, we're going to focus on the mechanics most of all, but we're also going to talk about the archetypes a little bit because we do know what those are as well. So let's go ahead and start with the mechanics. And I want to start with, you know, there's a lot I like about how this set looks, but there's one thing that's really disappointing. And I made a post about it on the community tab that ended up being wrong and misleading. So I want to address this mechanic first. And that is that lessons are back in this set. If you played back during Strixhaven, you know that was a mechanic where if you had a card with Learn, you could grab any lesson out of your sideboard. And that was a cool thing to do. It made limited interesting. It made drafts interesting. It made all of your cards with Learn really flexible. This set does have lessons. They have returned, but it doesn't have a single card with Learn. Instead, as we'll see when we talk about the archetypes, there are lesson payoffs. So lessons are going to be in your main deck in this format, and yeah, they're not really a unique or interesting mechanic in any way, unfortunately. So got that out of the way. Now let's move into looking at the new mechanics in this set. And of course, each of the different kinds of bending in the Avatar world have their own mechanic, and I think all of them look pretty interesting. Airbending is the first of these, and we've got Airbending Lesson. So this is one of those lessons that you can't actually grab out of your sideboard in the format. And actually, I'm using a lesson for a bunch of these because they are like the most basic versions of each of these mechanical effects. Airbending means you exile something, and while it's exiled, its owner may cast it for 2 generic rather than its mana cost. So one thing that I think is really cool about this mechanic are the 2 main ways you can use it. You can use it as a form of temporary removal, generally speaking. You can get rid of a token permanently, but obviously that's not as good a value. Mostly, you can use it as kind of a card to get a blocker out of the way. Like, it's going to be useful in aggressive decks sometimes to just say, okay, I airbend your best creature. Sure, you can cast it again, but you do have to pay that 2 mana, and as long as it doesn't have an interest trigger or something, you're coming out ahead there for the most part, especially in a card like Airbending Lesson, which draws you a card. So you're not always going to be able to card a value with Airbend, so it's nice to tack draw a card onto it. But of course, the other way you can use it is, for example, on your own stuff. You could do it to rebuy an interest trigger. You can do it to help a creature dodge removal, sort of. I mean, it still gets removed, but you can recast it. There are also payoffs for casting things from exile in this set, and in a lot of sets, those payoffs aren't really for the limited format, but because of airbending, it is a thing in this set to be able to airbend and cast things from exile, and pretty cheaply too, because it's always going to be too generic. So it's a cool mechanic because it can be used so flexibly. It'll be interesting to see whether it ends up being on more of the aggressive end, where you're using it to allow you to get in for a better hit, or whether you're using it more for like a value or defensive purposes. But it's great that it can do all of it, because a card that just rebuys interest triggers usually isn't good, and a card that just blinks an opposing creature usually isn't good. But this can do both with a little bit of added upside because of the whole cast from exile thing. And it's a little better than blinking your opponent's creature, because they do have to pay for it, even if it's only 2 mana. So that's airbending. So there's also waterbending, and we've got waterbending lesson here. So waterbending means that while you're paying for a waterbend cost, you can tap your artifacts and creatures to help. Each one pays for 1 generic. So it's like Convoke, but it never appears in the casting cost of something, or almost never. I mean, so far from the cards we've seen, it shows up all on activated abilities or additional costs, like it does here, where you draw 3 cards and then you discard a card unless you waterbend 2. So you can tap down 2 things to do that, but you can also still just pay 2 generic. So, it's like a kicker cost and a flexible one on this particular card, where you are able to pay for it by tapping stuff other than lands, or by tapping lands, or some combination thereof. So it's going to be generally more accessible to waterbend than it looks. Like if this was just kicker 2 generic, it would be a lot less easy to use, but you can be completely tapped out in terms of your mana and still pay this waterbend cost. There are payoffs in the set for tapping creatures here and there, so you can get some extra value out of that. In addition to being sort of like kicker costs, I do want to show you an example of it being a activated ability, which you can see on something like Geyser Leaper, which has waterbend 4, draw a card, discard a card. And on something like that, it's obviously repeatable. So if you have enough permanents around, you can use this ability multiple times a turn, and that's pretty good. You're going to have access to these way more than you normally would, like random activated ability that costs some number of generic mana. It's not as interesting, I don't think, as airbending, because it's, exactly like a mechanic we've seen before. Just instead of it being in the casting cost, it's somewhere in the text box that you can tap stuff to pay for it. And you can also tap artifacts, not just creatures, like with Convoke. There's also earthbending. This always comes with a numerical value, and what it means is that target land you control becomes a 0/0 creature with haste that's still a land, and you put that many +1/+1 counters on it. And then when it dies or gets exiled, you return it to the battlefield tapped. So this is pretty interesting. Like we've seen Awaken before. That was a way to animate lands that was built into a mechanic back in Battle for Zendikar block. But this is substantially more interesting, namely because not only does it animate the land, like, you get a land out of it, a creature out of it, even though you're using up a land at the same time, but that's the thing, you're kind of not. So like if you end up trading with your Earthbend 4 creature, your 4/4 land, you get your land back. So you don't give up a whole card worth of value necessarily on board. Now, you did use Earthbending Lesson, so you're still losing a card of value there because you used up a card, but you're never going to get blown out or anything. Furthermore, there is sacrifice stuff in this set. We'll talk about it a little bit when I talk about archetypes. And sacking something that's been Earthbent is pretty good value too, for the same reason. The land comes back tapped. Now, one thing I do want to note, when we're evaluating these cards, is that almost always paying 4 and Earthbend 4 is worse than just being 4 mana, make a 4/4 token. And that's because you don't have to use a land to make it into a creature. You just get a creature on top of, still having your land. And this does try to mitigate against that with the whole recursive land thing it has going on. But it doesn't entirely. Having a 4/4 and then still having a land that you can tap for mana and not also be tapping a creature, is a big difference. Now, on the bright side, in addition to sacrifice synergies, the set also has +1/+1 counter synergies. It also has land synergies in general. So I think this is going to end up hitting a lot of synergy points because of how it interacts with sacrifice, how it interacts with counters, how it interacts with land payoffs and stuff like that. All of that will allow this mechanic to play, I think, pretty well. I do just want to say, generally, especially if you don't think about synergy at all, 4 mana, 4/4 is better than Earthbending. But yeah, it is, the haste thing does matter some, but generally when they put this on cards, it's mostly there to avoid feel bads, because one thing people often don't think about is like they play their 5th land, and then they cast Earthbending Lesson and they animate that new land. But that new land will now have summoning sickness. And so they add the haste thing so that you don't make that mistake. And it's an easy one to make. And it's wise to do. I think I like that they do it, because that seems, obviously you could just cast it on one of your other lands and animate that one, and it won't have summoning sickness. They want to basically prevent that mistake from happening. And then the last of these 4 elemental bending mechanics is firebending. Firebending also comes with a numerical value, and what it means is when this creature attacks, you add an amount of red equal to that firebending value, but that mana lasts until end of combat. So this is also a pretty cool take on, sort of a ramp-like mechanic that we haven't ever seen as like across the board in a set as a well-supported mechanic. We occasionally see cards that like give you mana in combat and then you can't use it in any other way, but this set has a bunch of it. And I think it's pretty interesting. You can see it on Fire Sages here. So it's a 2 mana 2/2, attacks, and it can give you 1 red mana. And if they didn't do a good job of seeding the set with ways to spend that mana, it wouldn't be that good. Like, they had to really think about how to implement this. And I think they did so successfully, because a lot of the cards, like Fire Sages, come with built-in places to spend that mana before you lose it. Obviously, you could use it on an instant, and they have made sure there's a lot of those in this set, especially, in red and black, where you see firebending the most. And you can use it on instants, of course, but not having a spell to cast is gonna happen. So having, these mana sink abilities, it may not be insane, like this one, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature for 1 generic and 2 red, but it still gives you something to do with the mana, and the more firebending things you have, it's likely the more mana sinks you have, and you're gonna have places to spend the mana. So I think this is gonna be a really interesting mechanic. I'm maybe the most curious about this one, because we've never really seen this before, certainly not like this and not in these quantities. So I think all 4 of those certainly look interesting. Obviously, I think waterbending and earthbending both are maybe a little less interesting, because we've seen what they are so many times as big mechanics in a set. But there are different spins on those 2 mechanics. But I do think firebending and airbending especially are quite unique. All right, we do have 3-ish returning mechanics to look at that are returning in a big way. Remember, these days they have lots of deciduous mechanics. Like there's a couple landfall cards in the set, but it's not a big theme in the set for the most part. It's just something that appears on a few cards, whereas I'm focusing on mechanics that show up in like a substantial way that are likely to impact the format. And one of those is Exhaust, which you can see on Rough Rhino Cavalry here, which is also another example of firebending, and as well as the fact that firebending cards frequently have a way to spend the mana they make, and in this case it's with an exhaust ability. You can pay 8 generic and put 2 +1/+1 counters on Rough Rhino Cavalry, and it gains trample until end of turn. Exhaust means you can only use that ability once. We, of course, saw this quite recently in Aether Drift, and it played pretty well. The set did have lots of exhaust payoffs that made it even better, and they made lots of really aggressively costed things, like the 1 mana 1/1 that you could pay 4 to exhaust, and it made a 3/3 and got a counter. Like, that common was nuts. We'll see whether there's something quite that efficient. I mean, that's part of what made exhaust so good, is how it was costed. In this set, it mostly appears to be there as an exhaust, as a firebending payoff, basically, because it's a way to spend your mana at instant speed. Obviously, paying 8 mana just for this buff isn't very good, but you have a 5 mana 5/5 as the baseline, and then not even that much later after you play it, because of firebending, you can threaten to make it into a 7/7. You only want to do it when you have the mana around, you don't really want to do it instead of casting a spell in most cases, but it is a play that can be pretty good in the later stages of the game, and Rough Rhino Cavalry looks decent to me overall because of the decent baseline and its ability to remain relevant a little bit longer because of exhaust. So there's also at least one cycle of uncommon shrines in the set. Shrine is an enchantment subtype that we've seen before. Overall, these don't look that good to me. Shrine build-arounds are hard to make work in Limited because the shrines are always at uncommon, and while I think it's probably going to happen that every now and then you can make a build around shrine deck, the fact that all of these give you such a meager effect as a baseline, and then trigger again when another shrine enters isn't really enough. You know, the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty shrines kind of worked, some of them did, because they were creatures, right? They could add a real body to the board, and while Crescent Island Temple adds one, like the baseline on that card is 4 mana for a 1/1 monk with prowess. That's not a good rate, and you have to play some other shrines, or that's all you're ever going to get out of it. So they all worry me significantly in terms of actually being build aroundable. For limited, they may be here more for other players, but it is worth noting they're here. I'm sure someone at some point will manage to make a nuts shrine deck in limited, but I don't see it coming together a ton. Obviously, this means prowess is also in the set, but it's one of those deciduous mechanics that we see in almost every set anyway. It's not quite evergreen, but it's close. We do also have double-faced sagas returning. That is, sagas that transform into something else with their last chapter. This is something else. I think we last saw it in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. We sort of saw it in Final Fantasy where a creature turned into a saga and back into a creature. But these are sagas on the front that transform as part of one of their chapters. And the ones we've seen so far, I mean, they're mythic, so it's not too surprising that they made them all pretty pushed. They all look quite good to me. Mechanically, the thing to remember about them is that they get exiled and returned, so when they transform, unless they have haste, they're not going to be attacking right away, and that, matters. But they look great. With sagas, we always have to keep in mind that they take some time, but we've seen time and time again that even though they can be slow, if the rate you're paying for those things is absurd, it's still really great, especially in limited. I think the Rise of Sozin especially looks ridiculous because it's a Wrath, which normally I don't love Wraths in limited, especially at 6, because they're symmetrical, they're awkward in a lot of situations. But because of how this card works, you basically always come out ahead because you get the Wrath with Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is a little bit of a throwaway effect. But then Chapter 3, it transforms into a creature. So it's basically a Wrath that gives you a creature, even if it takes a couple more turns. And then the creature you get is nuts. The board is likely to be empty, and you have a 5 mana 5/5 with Menace and Firebending 3, and then you can spend mana from Firebending and otherwise when it attacks or does combat damage to a player. And then you can put creatures from their graveyard into play, depending on the amount of mana you spend. So basically, it obliterates the board and then gives you a creature that can single-handedly rebuild it. And that's kind of how they all are. They give you some real value up front, and then give you a formidable creature on the other side. And there aren't as many of them as in Neon Dynasty, where every saga did that. In this set, I think it's just a cycle of mythics. All right, so those are the mechanics, new and returning. They all look pretty cool to me. I have a lot of positive feelings about this set that I never had about Spider-Man already. Just feels like it's more carefully designed and not as rushed overall. So let's look at the archetypes now. It looks like they're going to be really well supported, and we have a full 10. That was another problem with Spider-Man. It had 5 in a small set, but anyway, we've got a full 10 of them, and I think they're quite well supported. There is a typical Signpost Uncommon. That is a card that always needs 1 mana of each of a color pair's colors in each color pair. There's also a hybrid uncommon that costs hybrid mana, meaning you can pay mana of 1 of 2 colors for those colored pips. That is also a signpost, but can kind of stretch into other decks because of the hybrid mana cost. And there's also a hybrid common that serves a similar role. We haven't seen every single one of these for every color pair right now, but we have at least one of these for every color pair. And Wizards of the Coast also posted the list of what the archetypes are, although the image is incredibly low res as of when I'm posting this. But, I'll read them out so you don't have to squint to see the what the low quality image says. Let's start with green-white. So you may have already seen on some of the cards I've shown you so far, allies are back in this set, and in green-white, that's what the archetype is. There are tons of them all around. It's kind of like heroes were or villains were in the last set. Basically, a huge number of cards in this set have the creature type, and it's especially concentrated in green-white, which especially likes going wide with allies. You can see White Lotus Reinforcements, just a lord for allies that is reasonably costed. It's often going to come down and buff multiple creatures. And the hybrid uncommon that we have right now is Suki Kyoshi Warrior, which is an ally, and when it attacks, it makes an ally that's tapped and attacking, and its power is equal to the number of creatures you control. So pretty obvious what's going on in green-white. It's the ally deck. Let's look at blue-red now. So, like I mentioned, prowess is back in the set, and a big focus in the set for this color pair is on non-creature spells and getting value out of them, but also lessons. You know, that's the subtype I mentioned. You don't get them out of your sideboard in this set, but there are a bunch of cards that get better when you do have a lesson either in your graveyard or when you cast a lesson, or that reduce the cost of lessons, and those are really concentrated in blue-red. Dragonfly Swarm looks like a really good signpost to me. You know, it's 3 mana for a star 3 with flying in Ward 1. Its power is equal to the number of non-creature, non-lands in your graveyard. We've seen lots of cards like this be successful in Limited before. This is actually more flexible than most because it doesn't just count instants and sorceries. It counts instant sorceries, enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, whatever. You're not going to have any planeswalkers. There aren't any in this set, but you know what I mean. It counts so many different types that it's going to be even easier to have really high power. And then if there's a lesson in your graveyard, when it dies, you draw a card. And so if you can set this up where, like, even if it's just a 3 mana 2/3, but you have a lesson in your graveyard, its power will go up throughout the game. And if your opponent ever kills it, they get 2 for 1. And I don't think that's going to be that hard to pull off. It looks like that's very doable in the set. There are lots of lessons and lots of non-creature spells. So this looks like a strong signpost to me. So in red-white, we have what is also a go-wide style deck, but it's not focused so much on allies, even though a lot of cards in the deck are allies. It's focused more on just going wide in general. You can see that on Sun Warriors, which is the main signpost uncommon. It has Firebending X, where X is the number of creatures you control. So that could get out of hand. Plus, like a lot of Firebending cards, has a built-in way to spend that mana, which also helps you go wide. So you can see how things could potentially snowball here. And, a 4 mana 3/5 with just this activated ability would be a card you play pretty much all the time. So throw Firebending in, and this has potential to really, really go wild. So yeah, you want to go wide, and you have various paths for going wide with any kind of creature, not just, more of a focus on allies than anything else. Let's look at black-green now, which is the earthbendiest color pair, but it's also into +1 and +1 counters. Those two things are related. So Daily Agents comes in and earthbends 1 twice. So you can either animate 2 lands as 1/1s, or you can actually earthbend on the same thing twice if what you really want is a 2/2. So it gives you 2 earthbent creatures, 2 creatures with +1 and +1 counters on them, and then it has an attack trigger where you drain X life from your opponent, where X is the number of creatures you control with +1 and +1 counters on them. Not just animated lands, of course, but any creature with +1 and +1 counters, and there are other ways to do it. But in black-green, the primary way you're going to be getting counters on things is with earthbending, but keep in mind it works with any sort of payoff, and that attack trigger can be pretty nasty in the right spot. I don't love that it's a 5 mana 3/4. Like, there's not a great chance it survives combat on most boards when it's attacking on turn 6. But if it can trade and drain a bunch of life after also giving you 2 1/1s, albeit animated lands that are 1/1s, you're going to feel pretty good about it. So it still looks like good value to me. You can also see we've got Long Fang Grand Secretariat revealed, and it also is good with earthbending and counters, because when a creature you control or land you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put a +1 and +1 counter on target creature you control. So it overlaps. It likes it when your earthbent lands die, and then gives you a counter when they do. Black-white is what we'll look at next. It's a sacrifice deck, and as I mentioned when talking about earthbending, earthbent animated lands are good to sacrifice here because you get them back. So it works. Earthbending is something it likes, and it has access to it from black. So because those give you built-in sacrifice fodder. We've only got the hybrid uncommon right now for this color pair, and that's Hey Bye, Spirit of Balance, 4 mana 3/3 that when it enters or attacks, it lets you sack another creature or artifact, and if you do, you put 2 +1 and +1 counters on it. This is a card where you can clearly see how it overlaps with like black-green because it likes counters, but it also works, and it will be easier to cast in black-white, where it works with sacrifice stuff. And when it dies, you put its counters on another creature you control. So it can potentially be good sacrifice fodder too if you're in a spot where putting the counters somewhere else is worthwhile. Also, the hybrid common here also clearly shows this theme. It's 2 mana 2/1 that when it dies makes a 1/1. So 2 bodies to sacrifice, that's always really good fodder. Worth noting, you can sack artifacts too. It's not just creatures, and black does have a decent number of clues and stuff like that. So you're going to have artifacts to sacrifice too that are worth sacrificing. So black-red is the firebendiest deck, so it's a deck filled, ideally, with creatures that have firebending, so that you can get mana, and then ways to spend that mana when you do firebend. But as I've been saying throughout the video, almost every card with firebending in the set has a built-in way to spend that mana, and while it's not usually like an optimal way to spend the mana, it's a way to spend it when you don't have another way, which is really important, I think. Here, we've only got the common hybrid card right now, which is Vindictive Warden, but it shows you everything you're looking for. 3 mana, 2/3, it has Menace, so it can attack and give you that firebending mana for longer than a 3 mana, 2/3 without Menace can, and you can sink mana into it to do 1 damage to each opponent. Blue-white is a flying deck that also has like a sizable water-bending theme. We've only got the Signpost, hybrid Signpost uncommon right now. 3 mana, 2/4 vigilance, and when it attacks with at least one other creature, you draw a card. Mostly, it doesn't say anything about flying or waterbending, right? But vigilance works well with waterbending because it means you can attack and still tap it for waterbending costs. And attacking with a flyer is like the easiest way to trigger this and the best way to trigger it like all game long. So blue-white is mostly a flyers deck, but it does also have the densest amount of water bending. Blue-green is another color pair that cares about lessons, and it's also a ramp deck. Right now we've got the hybrid uncommon, which is Guru Pathic, a 4 mana 2/4, and when it enters you can look at your top 5 and you reveal a lesson, saga or shrine, from among those cards and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And when you cast a Lesson, Saga, or Shrine, you put a counter on another target creature you control. So that card is going to be good in the blue-green color pair because chances are pretty good that you get a hit off of it, and then also getting those triggers is good. I do really like that it also looks at Sagas. I like that it looks at Shrines less because those are going to be harder to play, but Sagas and Lessons are going to be in your deck. And this is going to be a 4 mana 2/4 that draws you a card and gives you a counter like a lot of the time. So it looks quite good. It'll be interesting to see what the other signposty cards do, but I think it's safe to say that they give you mana or care about lessons in one way or another. Red-green, meanwhile, is also a ramp deck, but it gets there a little bit differently. It comes with some firebending. And as you can see on Uncle Ero, there's a bit of a lesson sub-theme too. I think it's less concentrated here. This more feels like they put that on this card so that it would easily slot into both blue-red and blue-green, you know, which are the lesson decks, and most of what Uncle Ero has going on is firebending, you know, for the red-green color pair anyway, and having 4 power. As often is the case, red-green cares about that, and he helps enable that kind of stuff, while also making your lessons easier to cast and giving you some mana to use in combat. And that leaves us with one last color pair, which is blue-black. We've seen this mechanic, this archetype before, which is the draw 2 mechanic. We only really know that it's this because of Wizards telling us what the archetype is, because the signpost we have right now doesn't really do a draw 2 thing. It's just like a good card, a 5 mana 3/3 that mills 3 and then can let you cast non-creature, non-lands from an opponent's graveyard, and you can cast the exiled card and you can waterbend to do it. So, you know, just a good card that'll give you a 2-for-1, but not particularly synergistic. Doesn't draw you 2 cards, for example, but it does give you some nice value. So those are all of the archetypes and the mechanics. One last thing to note about this set is that there is a bonus sheet called the Source Material bonus sheet. However, it only shows up in 1 in 25 packs. Generally, I like sets that have bonus sheets that, you know, have a real impact on the limited format and make it more interesting in one way or another. This one's not really going to, so that's a little bit of a disappointment. You know, the lack of learn in the set and the lack of a good bonus sheet that matters are, you know, the 2 things that I'm not thrilled about, but basically everything else about the set looks good to me, and I think this one's going to feel, you know, some people hate Universes Beyond because it's Universes Beyond. For me, as long as the sets are good, I don't care too much. Spider-Man wasn't good. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles doesn't look like it's going to be good. But Final Fantasy, Lord of the Rings, these look like they're Magic sets. They're in worlds that could easily be one of Magic's planes. You know, it doesn't feel as weird and jarring. And it looks like it's well designed, which is more than could have been said about Spider-Man. So that does it for this video. Remember, the set review starts next week, so there won't be a Needs and Notes, but there'll be a whole bunch of limited content coming out next Friday and over that weekend. So you have that to look forward to. Thanks for watching.